All right, cool. So in this lesson, what we're going to be doing is talking about the Vray Fast SSS2 material, which is one of two subsurface materials that we're going to be talking about in the series of videos here. I've got some kind of funky liquid meshes that I made, brought in here. And the thing I like about these meshes is that they just really show, they have a lot of variation in thickness. You can really kind of play around with the subsurface radius a little bit. And we're going to get into a little bit of a character with the actual skin shader and just show some, show the different maps. But for the Vray Fast SSS, it's not as important. So we've just got some kind of abstract shapes going on. So let's get into the shader here. Take a quick peek at our scene. And we can see we've got, I changed up the light a little bit and kept it really heavily backlit, just so we can really see that backscatter while we're working. There's some pretty cool detail in these meshes too. You can see all this like nice little, I guess it's almost like lumpiness in the liquid simulation. This guy in the center, and then this guy on the other edge over here. I do also have a 1D LUT turned on, so you can see if that was an sRGB, that light would be a little clipped out, and the LUT is keeping all that nice and under control. All right, cool. So and here's our scene. You can see our geometry. So the liquid geo is going to be a little bit heavy in those scene files, but just bear with me. And then we've got another, this is a little bit lighter of a mesh for the interior piece. So the Vray Fast SS2, if we crack open our Hypershade and node editor, there we go. So here's our shader. And you can actually see I've got no maps in it right now. And let's just kind of cruise through this. So starting at the top, actually we could even, the best thing to do here, let's just create a brand new one. So let's get a Vray Fast SSS2. And this is going to be our new shader that we're going to start playing around with here. And we'll just kind of go through it one by one, really just kind of touch on all of the attributes of this shader. So one of the biggest changes inside of Vray 3 was the introduction of ray-traced subsurface scattering. It sort of existed in these weird kind of nodes that you could load from plugins and that kind of thing, but it really wasn't nearly as robust and integrated into the software as it is now. So you can see right at the top in general properties, general parameters, it is defaulting to ray-traced mode. And most of the time, that is going to be the type of subsurface that you're going to want to be using. It's perfectly accurate. It's going to be sampling on a per pixel kind of level. So it's kind of like brute force GI for our subsurface scattering. It's more in line with what other software is doing, like Arnold or RenderMan. And so Arnold or Mental Ray. And in general, it's just going to give you results that are much easier to control, and that just overall the quality will look a lot better. Now, it's worth mentioning, since this is still, I want to still touch on the other side of it, which is going to be our object-based illumination map or the pre-pass-based illumination map. You can see these two different types here. So the both of these can be thought of kind of like irradiance maps. They are pre-calculated, and they are, if we just talk about pre-pass for a second. Pre-pass is actually just calculated in screen space, just like a radiance map, and it has this pre-pass rate, which will do more passes. The benefit to this type of workflow, even though it's much more difficult, I feel, to get good results from it, is that you can save out the maps. Just like the radiance map, you can say, you can just say load map, and you can actually, you can cache these out if you want to. But most of the time lately, I've really just been sticking to ray traced SSS. I tend to use subsurface the most on characters, and so when I'm using any sort of ray tracing with characters and they're changing and moving and deforming and all of that kind of stuff, you have to calculate it every frame anyways, and they really sped up the ray trace subsurface quite a bit, and it's really quite beautiful. So I do encourage you, I'm not going to touch on it, the object-based and prepass too much in this video, but I do encourage you to kind of read about it just so you have a little bit of knowledge. But the ray trace is going to get you most of the where you need to go. So this shader is broken up. Actually, right at the top here, you'll notice there are some presets, which are pretty cool. So you can see if I do milk skimmed, for example, skim milk, so like 0%, you can see it goes through and does set some attributes for me, which is kind of nice. And if I want to do like skin pink or skin brown or skin yellow or whatever it may be, there's going to be some values set down here for you. So you can see just those very subtle differences in skin tone between these types of skin. We've got ketchup, cream, this weird thing Spectralon, which I'd have to look up what that actually is, potato, and you get the idea. So you can notice that most of our objects here are water-based stuff, water-based materials like milk and ketchup and skin and marble and whatever it may be. So being that these objects are organic, the index of refraction is going to be usually set at 1.3. You can see marble goes up to 1.5 because it's a actual kind of stone material. And then if we set it back over to milk, it goes back down to 1.3. So even if we just kind of scroll down here, let's just shrink our general parameters. The first thing that's the most obvious value of subsurface that we want to be playing with, assuming you do have a basic knowledge of how subsurface works, basically a light ray will enter the mesh and it will diffuse and bounce around. And on the front-facing surface, it will return your subsurface color. And when that ray actually goes in and exits on the backside, it will return this scatter color. So the scatter color is going to be also based off of this radius, and you will get a nice gradient of color from one to the other. I don't know where my render settings are. There we go. So let's show that V-Ray frame buffer again. You can see exactly what we're talking about here. So on the front-facing surfaces here, where the ray just simply touches the surface, we get that nice blue. And on the thinner parts of the mesh, we get a nice red from, you can see these are the attributes I was using. I've got a radius of 2, and I've got blue and a red scatter color. So next we have this phase function value, which goes from -1 to +1. And the way you can kind of think about this and the way the documentation talks about it is essentially it controls the way the light bends in the object. And I actually like to just turn on my IPR and play around with it. But in general, negative values tend to favor backlighting, whereas positive values tend to favor front lighting. So you can see if I type in, or if I use my skin, it's set to 0.8. If I go to ketchup, we've got 0.9. If I go to skim milk, still 0.8. I thought one of these actually had, so there's marble. So marble has a really heavy backlighting, so it's got the negative phase function. So I don't get too scientific with that. For me, it's a little bit more about the look. A lot of these values, I just kind of dial them while I am just kind of running an IPR session in the background. The subsurface color and the scatter color are based off of our scatter radius here. And we also have a diffuse component. So the way this works with the diffuse is we do have a scalar value here. And the scalar value, let me just actually make this green so it's really obvious. This scalar value amount, diffuse amount, is kind of just V-Ray blend shader, essentially blending back to a regular non-subsurface material. So if you have like a character's skin, or maybe it's like a monster or something and he has really rough skin and you want to control where that subsurface actually is, you can have a map controlling the amount, and you can have a separate diffuse element in your shader. Some look dev artists I know even will introduce a little bit of diffuse into stuff like skin. Really low values like 0.3 or 0.03, 0.01, just so there's a little bit of that shadowing in the diffuse. I don't personally do that, but I have seen people that do that. So let's go back, let's maybe get that blue color again. We also lastly have this overall color parameter, and this overall color parameter will be acting like a multiplier for the entire shader for both diffuse and subsurface. So it's pretty cool. It does work. All of this stuff does now in V-Ray 3 work with the IPR. That's a new feature. Got my little render view here. So I'm going to do my IPR render. And as I'm kind of dialing these values, let's go bounce back over to our shader. So this is our milk shader here. So even just going and saying and bouncing this to negative values, you can see that it does some interesting stuff, especially down in here where the backlighting is really shining through, and it almost feels a bit more transparent. Whereas if I go to the positive phase function, it kind of dulls the whole thing and it makes it a little bit more front scatter heavy. So again, I don't usually get too crazy scientific with this stuff. I just kind of dial the phase function value to look in my render. Maybe if we make this a little bit more red, you can start seeing that come through. And then if I set that phase function, it just gets a little bit brighter. All of these values now, I totally prefer to just dial them completely in the IPR here. And it's feeling pretty cool. So that's really essentially the diffuse and subsurface section here. So we've got our scatter radius. So in this case, as you dial that up and down, you can see it just kind of fade in and fade out. Maybe I want to have a little bit more than that. So like 0.5, it's feeling pretty interesting. Our diffuse color, so if I set that to green and I start slowly dialing that up, you can see if it's totally green, it's just a complete Lambert type shader. So in this situation, I would probably want to have this kind of creamy color. And that creamy color, I could maybe just dial in a little bit to have it diffuse out some of that subsurface so it has a little bit more of that regular V-Ray material quality to it. Just get rid of that. The subsurface shader does also have a specular layer built into it, so you can see it's just pretty standard, same as the V-Ray material. Right below that, this is where things get a little bit more interesting. Briefly, before I get into that, your quality of your ray trace subsurface is going to be this guy right here, single scatter subdivision. So if I want a higher render quality, I can start increasing that, and this is linked to my adaptive max subdivs right here. All right, so back to our options. So you can see right now I am in single scatter mode of simple. If I click this down, little drop-down menu here, we've also got ray trace solid and ray trace refractive. So the difference between these three options on the single scatter menu really come down to the type of material that you're going to be rendering. So first we have simple. In simple, it's essentially a bit of an approximation of the surface lighting, and it's really meant for more opaque materials like skin. And it's materials where you can get away with a slightly less accurate ray tracing, subsurface result. And anything I usually will keep this on simple for if I'm doing fruit or anything character related. Sometimes even if I've got a cartoony character, I'll start adding subsurface on clothes or trees or leaves or plants. All that stuff, I always keep it as simple. The next mode here, ray traced solid, is actually going to physically calculate the volume inside of the mesh. And so that is, you can actually see I'm getting quite a bit more detail down in this area in here, whereas if I flip back to simple, it's a little bit softer. So let's go back to ray trace solid. And so some of those areas of brightness are going to show through a little bit better. And this is really supposed to be used with the much more translucent materials. In the documentation, it actually specifically mentions milk and marble. I've also had really good luck using this for juice and some yogurt one time. Stuff like that, where you really want to allow that light to penetrate through. So let's crank up our scatter radius a little bit. And let's play with our phase function. Let's take it negative here. And just really quickly, what I'm going to do is we'll just do one quick render first with ray trace solid, and then I'll do another render of simple. And I'm just going to save these in my render history. There we go. And I'm going to, once that's, I'm just going to pause the video while those render out, and then we'll be able to talk about them. All right, cool. So basically we've got, hold on one second. So basically we have here, I did 3 renders for you to show each mode. First being simple, which is loaded up here, and I'm going to set that as A. Next we've got this one here, which is going to be our ray traced solid. I'm going to set that as B, which is going to be on the right side here. So it's a very subtle change, but what you start to see is much more brightness in thinner details. So you can see if I kind of zoom in here, check this out. Overall, there's more transmission happening, and it's got a bit more contrast in the subsurface as a whole. I did go in and change the, while it was paused, I changed the phase function to a little bit lower. This is like negative 2.92 at the moment, because it was acting a little bit weird when I had it pretty low negative. So it's a subtle change, but it's a pretty good rule of thumb to just consider those opaque but highly translucent surfaces like milk, marble, jade, those types of things to use this ray traced solid mode. Now the third mode, which I also went ahead and did a render for, is this ray traced refractive mode. And let's just set this now to our A. And you can see it is very different. So the ray trace refractive mode literally will take your scatter color and pump it through and treat this whole surface like it's actually transparent. So this works really well for watery liquids. This also does work well with the negative phase function. I have gotten really nice results from that. So it's a very interesting look. So if you wanted like some sort of like hand-blown glass where there was milky volumes inside of the clear and transparent edges, this ray trace refractive mode is what you're going to be looking for. It's a very cool way to get this effect without having to combine subsurface scattering over top of glass or something like that. So it's pretty nice little shader with all of those modes. And you can see the last little part of this is just some simple bump mapping. So the bump map, you can just pump it in just like a regular Vray material. So you can get pretty creative with it, as you can kind of see. You can definitely do some pretty interesting stuff simply with a regular subsurface. And the introduction of this new ray traced subsurface inside of V-Ray is going to be really excellent. As of this video being recorded, V-Ray 3.1 just came out, and in V-Ray 3.1, subsurface scattering is going to be viewable in the CUDA GPU accelerated V-Ray RT as well. It's one of the new features I thought I'd really quickly mention, which is pretty cool. So definitely have a lot of fun with it, and just kind of play around with it. It's a really awesome shader, and you can do some really phenomenal things with it. So I'm going to actually go ahead and just set this to ray trace solid, and I'm going to crank up my single scatter subdivisions a little bit. We'll just say 16. And I'm going to just actually, let's click set A. There we go. So we'll clear all of that out. I'm just going to do one quick full render of this. And I'm going to we'll set our phase function to be 0.5. There we go. So there you go. Really beautiful result. You can see that render took about 2 minutes. There's definitely still some subsurface noise in there, so I'd want to go ahead and turn up my single scatter subdivision a little bit higher. On this other shader that I have in the scene, it's this guy here. I did have it up to 32 to clean up all of that subsurface noise. So I'm going to go ahead and save out this file for you. It'll have the blue shader as well as this other kind of milky whatever we made here kind of shader. And just feel free to play around with these meshes. They're kind of fun to just play with subsurface on because they have such an extreme contrast in their value. The last attribute on the shader that is worth mentioning is right at the top here, and it's this scale. So this scale will go and multiply the values that you have throughout your shader in regards to the scattering. So I normally try to leave this at 1, but in situations when you're dealing with animation, it may come up that animators need to scale up a character, for example, in a shot, and the rig may go from a scale of 1 to 0.8 or 0.9, maybe like 1.5. And if that happens, that can actually mess with your subsurface values. So, if I was to just scale this object way up, the amount in, the scatter radius that's coming in could change. So if transforms get frozen and all of that, then suddenly my 5 centimeters that I like the result of right here is going to be different if the scale of this is twice as big. So when you know that value, so for example, if I had this as animation coming in and it was getting cached and coming to me and it was twice the size it was supposed to, and I knew that, I can simply set this scale to 2 and it'll go through and multiply those values for me. And that's about it. So you'll notice if you do want to turn on, there is also a scatter GI checkbox. It will significantly slow down your subsurface. But for really photorealistic subsurface, you may want to experiment turning that on. But do keep in mind it will be pretty slow. So next we're going to be doing our V-Ray skin material, kind of continuing on the subsurface path here. So stay tuned.